Welcome back, everybody. Well, it's been a little while since we've done some alternate history, so I thought today would be a great time to dive back into some. And with Russia being in the news as much as it is right now, I thought this would be one of particular interest. And it's what if Operation Unthinkable had actually happened? Operation Unthinkable was a war plan that was worked on right at the end of the Second World War. And it was the British who came up with this plan. And war plans are a common thing. Governments always come up with war plans for different situations, different scenarios. The United States had a war plan called War Plan Orange that was one of their first attempts at figuring out what a naval war in the Pacific would look like against Japan. And that was decades before it actually happened. Operate the Schlieffen plan was the plan that was come up with in the first couple of years of the 20th century for the Germans in the event that they went to war with both France and Russia, and that was the plan they ended up using in World War I. So this is just one of a number of those plans that was out there. And Operation Unthinkable started out as a plan to say, okay, what would happen if when Germany is defeated, the Western Allies, particularly the United States and the British, went to war with the Soviet Union to try and push them back. And it was concluded in that plan that it would be ugly. It would be ugly. It would be difficult to win and would take a long time and be very costly. A second version of that operation then was planned, was a contingency plan that involved what happens if the United States leaves the continent at the end of World War II and the British are left to try and hold back Soviet forces from advancing into Western Europe. And neither one of those plans were ever adopted, but they did kind of become an interesting case study in the what ifs of what if the Cold War went hot. And it was only in the late 1990s that we even found out about the existence of these plans, the details. So let's go ahead and take a look. It's not a real long video, but it's from Alternate History Hub. I will put the link in the description as always, and I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? What would you do differently? And how do you see these things that we talk about here? Let's dive in.
It's no surprise that the West and the USSR hated each other. It's no surprise that immediately after Berlin fell, the Iron Curtain rose. Yet it is a surprise that there was a plan so ludicrous and dangerous, it not only would have caused World War III, but nuclear war.
It probably would have been a continuation of World War II. I doubt we would have called it World War III. Now remember, the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, while on the same side, weren't really allies in the traditional sense. It was more of the enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of thing. Because remember, the Soviet Union had also invaded Poland not long after the Germans did, and they had an agreement in place, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was a non-aggression pact with Germany that Germany violated. So there was always kind of this, kind of side eye going on between the two sides, and there's no surprise that people like General Patton on the American side were big advocates of continuing the war on against the Soviets, because a lot of people, Churchill was one of those people, saw what was coming in the post-war world, the influence that the Soviets were going to have, particularly on the Eastern European region that they had liberated. So
it came from none other than Winston Churchill. This plan was called Operation Unthinkable. Churchill was angry at the amount of countries the Soviets claimed influence over after Nazi Germany fell.
And remember, too, that there had been agreements put in place about what the post-war Europe was going to look like. Part of that was the division of Germany into zones of occupation. The Soviets were going to get what we know now today as East Germany. Then the Americans, the French got this, I think, part right here. I think the Americans had Bavaria, and then I think the British had northwest Germany. And so there were plans like that in place, but there were also plans in place where the Soviets had agreed to allow free and fair elections in places like Poland. And I believe the original Operation Unthinkable had a lot to do with Poland being the focus of, okay, we'll go to war if the Soviets don't let Poland have their freedom.
amount of countries the Soviets claimed influence over after Nazi Germany fell. He believed that when World War II was finished, that the USSR would have been on the brink of collapse. However, this was not the case, and Churchill did not like this new world. The USSR had begun installing new communist governments in Eastern Europe, and their armies were too far west in Churchill's eyes. Thus, he proposed a solution called Operation Unthinkable.
Let's take a look and read this for a second. If we are to embark on war with Russia, we must be prepared to be committed to a total war, which will be both long and costly. These are the conclusions of that. This is what I was talking about at the beginning. Our numerical inferiority on land renders it extremely doubtful whether we could achieve a limited and quick success, which is the only way they would really want to do that. You don't want a long, protracted war against an opponent like the Soviets with the massive manpower they have, even after all their losses in World War II. Even if the political appreciation considered that this would suffice to gain our political object. Interesting.
And it was truly unthinkable. The plan was a full-scale Anglo-American conflict against the Russians. It was meant to drive out the Soviet forces from Germany, Poland, and Eastern Europe to counter Russia's ever-growing power. Since it was so over the top, many thought Operation Unthinkable was suicidal. Thus, the plan of total war was quickly ignored by reasonable leaders. Soon after, Churchill was voted out of office for unrelated reasons.
But again, I don't think that Churchill asked for Operation Unthinkable to be kind of planned out because he was planning on making it happen. He's just thinking ahead and wanting to have all their ducks in a row and wanting to have these plans in place just in case.
Yet what if Operation Unthinkable was put into effect? What if it actually happened? What would be the outcome if such a strange plan was carried out? Well, here is one scenario. The first obstacle the Allied powers, allied as in British and Americans, would have had to overcome is the vast numbers difference between them and the Russians. The Russian force numbered in total of 11 million, 6.5 of which were on the German front. The Soviet armies simply outnumbered the Anglo-American force 2-1. So how would the Allies counter this? Well, the plan was to rearm 100,000 captured German soldiers.
Which is something that Patton talked about. One of the reasons Patton ended up getting fired from command of the Third Army, and then I think he had a post-war position as the military governor of Bavaria. One of the reasons he got fired from that is because he was leaving former Nazis in place in civilian positions of authority. And he was a big proponent of arming the German army, putting them on the American and Anglo side, and going after the Russians.
Soldiers and revived the destroyed German war machine, this time, however, under Allied control against the Russians. Yet even bringing back the Germans would not be enough to equal the Soviets, so there was another option.
You don't need to... I wouldn't go there. You don't need to equal the Soviets, though. I don't think that was ever the concern. Remember that the Soviet Union, while a strong army with great tanks and a lot of things going for them, they were getting a lot of their supplies throughout the war from the Western Allies. You cut that off, they're in a whole different situation. I don't think it's as daunting a task as one might think just because the Soviets have more men.
Nuclear war.
You also have to remember that Japan is still going. At this point, do you negotiate something with Japan? Do they go to war with the Soviets at some point? I don't know. Probably not.
Churchill knew about Project Manhattan and how the Americans had the potential to create a nuclear bomb. Keep in mind, this was before the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the plan was to harness American nukes to bomb USSR cities, most importantly Moscow, Kiev, and such. In his mind, this would be enough to crush the Soviets into submission and force their retreat, or at least disorient them while the Allied forces swept over Europe.
Back up for a second. I'm not entirely sure that bombing a city like Kiev would have been on the table. Kiev was in the middle of Ukraine, which was devastated by World War II, by the German occupation. I don't feel like that would have been a target.
Operation Unthinkable goes into effect. On July 1st, 1945, the Allied powers launch a full-scale military assault against Russian positions. This coalition of British, American, and German forces, 47 divisions in total, cross into communist territory. The fighting is brutal, drawn out, and an upward fight for the Allies. Not only would they need to push past Germany, but into Poland, East Russia, Moscow, or even farther to stop any USSR resistance. The Soviets begin to overtake the Allies, and the Americans decide to bring in the big guns. Diverting nukes that were meant for Japan, the US drops Little Boy on Moscow. The Kremlin and a large portion of the city is destroyed.
I feel like, I gotta look at some numbers, but I feel like the Western Allies, their air power would have been quite decisive in a battle. I don't buy the idea that nukes would have been necessary. I really just, somebody can argue with me and tell me why you think I'm wrong. I think I think the Germans, I mean, we got to remember the French are there too. And the French had a big army before when World War II broke out, most of which never really got used. You get the French, the British, the Americans, and what's left of the German army together, and I think it would have been more than 100,000 Germans. I don't see how the Soviets beat that. I really don't.
This catches the Russian forces off guard, and the Allies are able to push closer to Berlin. However, after the shock goes away, the Russians slowly fight back the Americans and British. This goes in part with the fact that the Russians simply outnumbered the Allies and eventually would be able to beat them back.
Yeah, again, he's really stuck on the numbers, as if outnumbering the Allies makes all the difference. I just don't see it that way at all. You got to think about so many other things. You got to think about the availability of supplies. Let me show you what I'm talking about. By the end of June of 1944, the United States had sent the Soviets under Lend-Lease 11,000 planes, 6,000 tanks and tank destroyers, and 300,000 trucks and other military vehicles, 350 locomotives, 1,640 flat cars, 500,000 tons of rails and accessories, axles and wheels, 3 million tons of food, and 10% of Britain's overall food supply went to the that was from the Americans to the British. But the Soviet Union, 3 million tons of food. All of that stuff was sent by the summer of 1944. And there was a lot more to it than that. The Soviet Union, while they had manpower, they were heavily reliant, mostly on the United States, but to a lesser degree on other allies, for their food, for their supplies, for a lot of what they needed to keep their military going. You add to that the massive amount of air power that the Allies had by 1945. And then you take the technology that the Germans had and were developing, and you give all of that to the Allies, and you let the Allies start mass producing that stuff. I'm sorry, I just don't see how the Soviets hold off. And it's not like the Allies are going to have to invade and push all the way into Moscow. They're not looking to conquer the Soviet Union. They're looking to keep the Soviet Union from having influence in Eastern Europe. Once you get into Soviet territory, I think you probably see a negotiated settlement to the end of the war. Then again, who knows what Stalin would do.
Perhaps a few more nuclear bombs would be dropped on Russia over the next few months, but this would not deter the Soviets. Soon the Russians would invade France and the Allies would retreat to Britain.
Not seeing
Soviet V-2 rockets could then strike London. This scenario isn't an 100% prediction, but just judging by the balance of power, armies, and conditions of the time, it's a fair representation of what probably would have occurred. The British and Americans simply weren't in the position to battle the Soviets right after a world war. The Russians had taken half of Europe and installed their own allied governments. That's the reason why Operation Unthinkable was never put into effect.
All right, I want to take a look at some numbers about what the armies looked like at the end of the war. Okay, so first things first, he mentioned that the Anglo-American-German alliance would be able to put 47 divisions into the war with the Soviets. The Americans alone had 61 divisions in Europe. When he said that number, something didn't sit right with me about that. But yeah, there were 22 divisions deployed to the Pacific, 15 in the Mediterranean, and 61 in Europe. So there's actually 76, although it looks like 7 were both. So I don't know if you count those separately or not. But, I mean, the Americans alone had more than 47 divisions available in Europe. And even if you don't commit all of them, you've got those available. So I think the manpower difference was not nearly what they think it is. Let me see what the Soviets had. So at the time of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Soviets had around 300 or so divisions. But their divisions, and they may have been up higher to 400 or 500 by the end of the war, but their divisions were significantly smaller on average than were the German divisions and probably the Allied divisions too. And remember, the Soviets had lost tens of millions of people during the war. I don't know what the percentage was, but they were pretty shot up. I don't know. Somebody argue with me and tell me why you think I'm wrong about this, because I really, of all the alternate history videos that I've done on his channel, this I think is the one that I disagree with the most. But maybe I'm completely off base here.
Or even considered as an immediate offensive measure. How do you think the world would be if Operation Unthinkable happened? Tell us in the comments. Like us on Facebook, subscribe if you have not done so.
All right, I love Cody. Just disagree with him on this one, but let me know in the comment section below what you think about all that, and I'll put a link in the description to the original content if you want to be able to watch it again without my commentary or check out some of his other alternate history stuff. It's really good stuff, and it's very entertaining. I've mentioned this before. The reason that I find alternate history interesting, I know a lot of people don't, is because it causes us to take a more critical look at what actually happened. By examining what might have happened, we think about the importance of those decisions and the importance of those events as they unfolded and how they might have gone differently if things had gone a different way. So that's why I think it's fascinating. It gives us just a different angle, a different lens through which to look at history. So let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.